My name is Tawfiq Haddad. I'm the director of the Council for British Research in the Levant's Jerusalem branch, known as the Kenyan Institute. Today we are pre-recording, or recording, shall we say, an interview with Dr. Mahmood Mamdani. So today's interview is going to be a little bit different than what we normally do with our webinars. Instead, I will jump straight into questions, see what we can learn from Dr. Mamdani in a much more informal fashion about what he has produced today. So before we get into that, this lecture is this conversation is brought to you by the Council for British Research in the Levant. It is also co-sponsored by the Educational Bookshop, which is the major bookshop in East Jerusalem. The Council for British Research in the Levant is an independent UK research charity and membership organization that exists to conduct, support, and promote humanities and social science research in the Levant. We are one of 7 different British Academy International Research Institutes, and we have over 100-year presence in the region, namely with the Jerusalem branch of the Council for British Research in the Levant, but we also have a branch in Amman. To introduce our speaker today, we have Dr. Mahmood Mamdani, who is an elected corresponding fellow of the British Academy in the year 2017. He currently serves as Chancellor of Kampala International University in Uganda and is the director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research, the Herbert Lehman Professor of Government at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, and is also Professor of Anthropology, Political Science, and African Studies at Columbia University. He is the author of many different books, perhaps most notable amongst them, Citizen and Subject, When Victims Become Killers, and Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, as well as the book that we will be discussing today, Neither Settler Nor Native, which came out from Harvard University Press just at the end of last year. So with all that said, allow me to sort of jump into some questions for Dr. Mamdani. I'm going to start off with your title of your book, Neither Settler Nor Native, subtitled The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities. You seem to be, in your articulation of neither settler nor native, be hinting towards a kind of problematic in this kind of dichotomy, or at least the conceptions of whether it's settlers or natives, or the dichotomy itself. Can you speak to some of the problematics that you feel you are trying to address through this book and through this particular title, Dr. Mamdani?
Thank you very much, Tawfiq. So I have several claims here. One is that settler and native are not permanent identities. Settler and native are identities created by a particular form of the state. I distinguish the settler from the immigrant. Immigrants, whether they are seeking advantage or equality, they come and settle in existing polities. Settlers seek to establish their own polity, subordinate those who have been living there, either by expelling them or by turning them into unequal people without the same rights as settlers. So I look forward to a different form of the state. A different form of the state. And here again, there are 2 options. Either those who came in and became settlers can be expelled or leave, for example, Algeria, or the state can be reformed. The political community can be reformed. so that neither origin nor culture becomes the basis of enfranchisement or sovereignty, so that there is neither majority nor minority which precedes the political process, so that all majority and minorities are the result of a political process. That's the only way one can have a democratic form of the state. So that's to state very briefly at the outset. That is really my very, very brief assertion.
Well, thank you for that. I guess the next following question that you would have that comes to mind relates to the broader question, insofar as the contemporary world is organized around the concept of the state and the nation state. And obviously there's an important distinction here. Is it really such a foregone conclusion that nation states must embody this kind of minority majority conception? I mean, after all, in the end of the day, the claim for national self-determination was a right that was recognized by the United Nations. It played a major role in the liberation of large parts of the global South, as you know. And is it even a foregone conclusion that they necessarily must act in the ways that you describe in the book, that ultimately you sort of describe a kind of reproduction of the cycles of violence, largely because of the kind of the definitions and the institutions that have been created formally under the colonial. But isn't there a progressive dimension to national self-determination? You seem to be, I mean, you're taking on a huge element of contemporary post-war and even perhaps pre-post-war political momentum and dynamics, so to speak. And I recognize what you're trying to say insofar as it is the problematics of the post-colonial state. But where do we draw our lines? What's the problem? And is there anything to be retained from the nation state?
You're right that the problem is not small. The nation state, in the introduction to my book, I give a genealogy of the nation state, beginning not from the Treaty of Westphalia in the 17th century, but beginning from 1492, the year when the Iberian state is set up. One country, one people, one religion. And the same year when the conquest of the Americas begins. And the year when minorities, Jews, Muslims, are expelled. This state form begins to spread throughout Europe. It's a form of national self-determination. We'll come to the question of what is the nation later. But it spreads throughout Europe, and the result is over a century of religious wars. The Treaty of Westphalia is supposed to be an antidote to religious civil wars. And the Treaty of Westphalia has two key components. One is that the national majority, the nation, will tolerate the national minority. And the other is that in return, this state would be recognized as sovereign by all other states in Europe. Now, this was theorized by John Locke. Locke, in his book on tolerance, argued that the majority in England, Protestants, will tolerate the minority in England, Catholics, so long as in return the minority does not pay allegiance to any other power outside England, neither to the Pope nor to anybody else. This is the liberal form of the nation state. Liberalism, as is well known, exalts, heralds individual rights. Liberalism is allergic to any form of group right, except one. This is the right of self-determination. This is the nation. So, what's wrong with national self-determination? What's wrong is that there is no place in the world where if you determine the nation on the basis of culture or descent, you will not have a minority or many minorities. The key question in self-determination is, who is the self? The self is determined, it's a cultural self, and it's pre-political. It's not a result of a political process. It determines, draws boundaries around the political process. And the self-determination is the determination of the majority. The majority is sovereign. The minority can have rights, but it is not sovereign. Palestinians in Israel have the right to vote, but they're not sovereign. They don't participate in power. When, after the Second Intifada, Balad and Azmi Bishara introduced this bill in the Knesset, demanding the right of Palestinians as a national minority. That bill would have only partially addressed the Palestinian question. Because once you acknowledge a national minority, you are acknowledging the nation as the majority. In other words, the Jewish nation with a Palestinian minority. And soon after, Azmi Bishara and Balad introduced a second bill in the Knesset. And that second bill said that Israel should acknowledge itself not as a state of the Jewish nation, but as a state of all citizens, all, not just majority, all citizens. This bill questioned the notion of both the nation and national minority. I argue in the book that though this did not succeed at the time, in Palestine, in Israel, Palestine, it showed a way forward. And I believe, well, we can discuss this later, if you prefer, but we have tended to see the phase that came after Balad, the phase identified with BDS and with boycott and divestment. I believe we should not see these two phases as alternatives. We should not see the bill presented by Balad and Azmi was looking to the inside of the Israeli state. BDS has come up with a strategy which is looking to the outside. How do you isolate the state internationally? My argument is that you have to do both. You have to do both because you have to isolate the Israeli state not only internationally, but also you have to isolate Zionist power internally. Modern colonialism, especially indirect rule. If you take modern colonialism, the first phase of modern colonialism, what is known as direct rule, was a civilizing mission. And that civilizing mission, just by the claim that the colonizer was civilized and the colonized were not, it introduced race as central to political identity. But its effect was, by doing so, by excluding the majority from political processes, from citizenship, it inadvertently, unintentionally brought the majority together. The result were mid-19th century revolts. It rocked the British Empire. From 1857 in India to the 1860s in West Indies to the 1890s Mahdiya in Sudan. These three events rocked the British Empire. There was a deep soul searching. The most important scholar who participated in this soul searching was a British legal anthropologist, Henry Maine. And Henry Maine said that the 1857 uprising was really the result of an epistemic error. That Britain had assumed they could wipe the state clean in India. And then they could write on this clean slate, tabula rasa, Lockean style. But India had its own history. Britain needs to understand the subjectivity of Indian people. It needs to identify every difference, every cultural difference in India, and decide which one is amenable to being politicized so as to reinforce the British camp. So began an amazing project known as Indirect Rule. which politicized cultural identities, argued that these were ahistorical. The political object was to fragment the colonized, to reverse what direct rule had done, to fragment the colonized, to complement racism with other kinds of politicized identities, depending on the history of different places, religion, tribe, caste. So the strategy was to fragment the colonized and to unify the colonizer. Same in Israel. Israel, Palestine. You can see the fragmentation of the Palestinian population. Refugees, West Bank, Gaza, inside Israel. But even inside Israel, the Bedouins separated from the Arabs, so on and so forth. Right? The idea is to create multiple minorities. But also, I mean, look at, and the idea is to create, to solidify a majority around the state. But it's not been easy in Israel because if you want to solidify, if you want to solidify this majority as a Jewish majority, you first have to decide who is a Jew. Is Jew a religious identity or is it an ethnic identity? Israeli law has never been able to decide this. It has two definitions of a Jew. One, in the law of personal affairs, it's a religious definition determined by halakha, religious law. The other, in the legislation on the right of return, is a different definition. But that's not all. That's in the state and the legal sphere. But then you come to the social and cultural sphere. Because over time, it is the Mizrahim who have become the majority of Jews in Israel. But the Israeli state was established not by the Mizrahim, but by the Ashkenazim, Western European Jews speaking the Yiddish language from Eastern Europe. And the social project of the Israeli state was to homogenize the amazing diversity amongst Jews globally during the diaspora, to homogenize them, to flatten that diversity. And that was done by an Ashkenazi diktat over the Mizrahim. The Mizrahim were forced to shed, denounce, because the Mizrahim are Arab Jews. They were forced to shed and denounce their Arab culture, language, and to define their identity in exclusively religious terms as Jews, Judaism, exclusively religious terms. But the Mizrahim paid back. They paid back by organizing around a religious Zionism to the right of the Ashkenazim. So the Mizrahim today have two enemies, Palestinians and Ashkenazim. Well, I think there is you see, if we want to maintain cultural diversity, and if we want to have a citizenship that makes no distinction between majority and minority, none whatsoever, then we have to think of another form of the state.
This is where I wanted to go with the thing. Can you speak to what the answer then is to the nation state, and what you argue in your book? What is the best way to rejoin this dilemma or this problematic, so to speak? Not necessarily in regards to Israel-Palestine, but in the broader context, because you are making those claims for every supposed nation state, from the United States to Germany to also Israel-Palestine. What are you arguing?
So let me give you the example of South Africa, because in the book I say we should look to South Africa not for a model, but for a way forward. So in 1994, when the apartheid state, or some aspects of the apartheid state, were being shed, one of the and the first non-apartheid election was going to be held. The key question in that election was, who should have the right to vote? And there were two positions. One position said, only citizens should vote. The other position said, no, all residents should have the right to vote. Now, the difference was huge, because residents in South Africa included millions of non-citizens, millions of migrants, migrants from across the border, from Malawi, from Mozambique, from Zimbabwe, from Lesotho. And in the mobilization that began in the 1970s and brought the apartheid machine to a halt by the late 80s, in that mobilization, in the first phase, the 70s phase, migrant workers were key. They were the first to be unionized. And pivotal in this unionization effort were radical white students. There were not many. I mean, they were several handfuls, that's all. But they provided the secretaries, the legal advice to the unions that sprang up. They also provided a model to an alternative to white South Africans when the crisis deepened in the late 80s and early 90s. These migrant workers, in the hundreds of thousands, they mobilized and they unionized in the hundreds of thousands. They formed the first trade union federation, COSATU. The second one followed a decade later, COSATU. Migrant workers were still there, but not as prominent. Now, from 1994, in the new dispensation, the Zulu Inkatha Freedom Party and its leader, Gatsha Buthelezi, got control of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And from 1994 on, they began to chip away at the rights of migrants, especially to disenfranchise them politically. And also to tell their own constituency that migrants cannot have the same entitlements you do This is your country, not their country. So I see in this contest, because this notion, this is your country, not their country, even though they work here, they labor here, the fruit of their labor is here, and that is the contest between the nation state and the glimpse of another form of political community. Initially summed up in the 1955 Freedom Charter of the African National Congress, which said, South Africa belongs to all those who live in it, not to its citizens, to all those who live in it. Now, I will be the first to admit, I don't have a blueprint. And I don't believe it is the job of an intellectual to manufacture blueprints in his or her study. I think the way forward is charted first and foremost in the struggles of popular movements. And one needs to look at these movements to study them. They provide us with the raw material, which is necessarily contradictory, necessarily tension-ridden. And it's the job of the intellectual to systematize what social movements constantly, continually, time and again, bring to the fore through a process of trial and error. So I'm not a liberal theorist. I mean, I don't ascribe to the notion of liberal political theory that the theorist should come up with an answer to the question, the good society. I think that's giving too much credit and power to the intellectual.
You credit, my final question, thank you for that answer. You credit the power of social movements to be able to navigate these political tensions. And you also argue that there is this need to, of course, sort of delink or decouple the nation and the state and sort of seek to build a new political community around this concept, with South Africa providing not a template, but a lot of fertile ground to work with. With that said, you've limited it to sort of an intellectual process as well as a social movement process. But I'd like to ask you to speak just a little bit about where the material comes in. The material as in the economic and accumulation and production, because obviously ideas do not just emerge out of thin air, and people's ideas will not simply shift one way or another simply because they seem more convincing, so to speak. In the South African model, at the end of the day, the white South African minority was a minority that relied upon the exploitation of the Black and colored labor force. And the pariah status that the movement in South Africa was able to sort of impose upon white South Africa ended up creating those contradictions that that led some white intelligentsia to break away. But so there clearly are material factors there that are also part of the question. I recognize that it's not your role to give a full political program. And but do you want to say anything about the material dimension to what you're speaking about?
Sure. I mean, look, you're obviously right. We cannot just rethinking at the political level. We have to think of the marketplace, and we have to think of culture, through which we make meaning. I mean, I come from a Marxist background. I was a member of the first post-independence generation of African intellectuals. And we believed that with independence, if there would be violence, it would be along class lines. It would be shaped by wealth and poverty, the rich facing the poor facing the rich. The violence would either be revolutionary or counter-revolutionary. Then came the Rwandan genocide, 1994. The rich and the poor were not facing one another. The poor were facing poor and the rich were facing rich. And if you wanted to understand the division, it was ethnic. All kinds of right-wing scholars came out of the woodworks and said, see, this is what Africa is about. Africa is tribal. All conflicts in Africa are tribal. The tribes don't know how to live with one another. Peace has to be imposed from the outside. So it is in this environment that I wrote my book, When Victims Become Killers. It's a book on the Rwandan genocide. But it's a book mainly on the historical background, what led to it. And I realized that my Marxism was incomplete. My understanding of the marketplace creating tensions was incomplete. That actually I had to concede that the state is not just a reflection of tensions in the marketplace, but the state has its own autonomy, not just autonomy, because that word was used endlessly, but has its own creative movement. And the state actually does and can set in place a momentum counter to that generated by the marketplace. In South Africa, the marketplace, primitive accumulation, dispossession of the peasantry, pushed landless peasants into the urban areas. In the vocabulary of the state, Africans into the urban areas. 1940, mine workers' strike. The writing was on the wall. The South African state countered with apartheid, reorganizing African society along cultural lines, ethnic lines, giving ethnic self-determination, autonomy to each of the Bantustans, homelands, pushing the excess population out of towns into the rural areas. Apartheid was first and foremost a political project designed to stabilize apartheid society. Now, you're right that political form, apartheid, See, Marxist scholars understood apartheid as just a form of extracting cheap labor by paying less to black workers than to white workers. Sure, it was that, but that was not the main thing about apartheid. Apartheid fragmented the oppressed population. It reversed the trend to majority making across cultural lines, across ethnic lines. Apartheid was a political project, first and foremost. Now, again, you're right that with 1994, the huge inequalities in South Africa have not been addressed. When I was at the University of Cape Town, 1996 to 1999, I read the UN Human Development Index and the report that went with it, which said that if white South Africa was a separate country, it would be 14th in the world next to Spain. And if black South Africa were a separate country, it would be 114th in the world next to Congo. So of course you're right. The point is not that this is not an important question, it's a very important question. But we need something more than just the realization that extreme inequality exists. We need to have a strategy to bring together a movement which will be equal to addressing this question. And I think that movement will not be possible unless the political is reformed first, unless racial differences are depoliticized, unless the momentum that began in the 1970s with a handful of radical white students and grew in the 1980s in the face of the township revolt. So that not only did the apartheid state realize that this revolt could seep into the Bantustans, but also even scarier for them, that the white apartheid intelligentsia was beginning to flee from the apartheid project and look for an alternative project. So what I'm saying is, maybe two alternatives. One is civil war, and the other is social justice. The way forward in terms of attaining social justice is to address the questions that would lead to civil war, which is politicized race, politicized culture. Already you have what is called xenophobic violence in South Africa. It's curious that xenophobic violence in South Africa does not target the racial stranger, it targets the tribal stranger. Because whereas race, you have the beginning of depoliticizing race, tribe is still understood to be a natural phenomenon. Customary law organized ethnically, chiefs organized ethnically, homelands organized ethnically have survived 1994. But if you don't want a movement for social equality to spark a civil war between different Bantustans and urban areas, we have to first depoliticize culture and strengthen a new polity. Thank you.
Bless Dr. Mahmood Mamdani. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your time and this fascinating discussion that we've been able to have. We've been discussing today Neither Settler Nor Native, The Making and Unmaking of Permanent Minorities by Dr. Mahmood Mamdani, which came out from Harvard University Press at the end of last year. You've been listening to a conversation between Tawfiq Haddad and Dr. Mahmood Mamdani, brought to you by the Council for British Research in the Levant in Jerusalem, as well as the Educational Bookshop. Check us out online, www.cbrl.ac.uk, to sign up for forthcoming webinars and book discussions like this one, as well as our activities. Take care and have a lovely day. All the best.
Thank you so much, Tawfiq.
Bless.
And thank you to all those who, I hope, listen to this conversation.
Inshallah.